Professor Akram here, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to prep and export your 3ds Max model as an FBX for Unity. In this example, we have a model of a cherry that I did, and I want to export this model for use in Unity. So just like before, prior to even modeling anything, I set up my project folder in Max and I set the units to be equal to meters. Then I modeled my object. But before we can export this to be used in Unity, there are a few settings that we need to set to ensure that our object comes in at the right scale, orientation, and position. So that's what we're going to do now. The first thing I'm going to do is select my object, and we're going to start with the scale first. I'm going to right click on the scale tool, and this is going to give me the scale units of our object. And as you can see, it's set to 100, 100.082, and then 89.143. So what is going on here? Whenever you create a model inside of 3ds Max, the base measurement that you start off with, so in my case, I created a sphere with a radius of 1 meter, and that 1 meter round sphere it's 100%. So the default first measurements that you give your object is it's 100%. As you change your model, as you extrude out and as you scale your model in different ways, the scale factor changes. So here I've obviously increased the Y scale a little bit and decreased the Z scale, because as you can see in our cherry here, we've brought the top of our sphere in a little bit to give it a more organic look. Before we can export this into Unity, we want to make sure that our scale factor is set back to 100%. Now, we don't want to change these values, because changing these values will change the shape of the model. What we want to do now is tell Max that these scale values are equivalent to 100% the scale of our model. To do that, we need to go over to our Utilities tab and take a look at Reset XForm. The Reset XForm takes the current transform of our model, whatever their values are, and sets them equivalent to a default setting. So our scale factor is going to be reset so that it's now equivalent to 100%. So this is the 100% scale of our object. So with the object selected, and I've got the scale transform tool open here so you can see these values update, I'm going to come down here where it says reset transform and choose reset selected. This resets the scale for the object. So its current scale is now equal to 100% scale. And I'm going to go ahead and close this dialog, and I'm also going to get out of the Reset XForm and return back to the Create tab. Once we've set the scale, there are a few other items that we need to address. The first one being the pivot point of our object. This is a central location that identifies the position of the object and the rotational axis of the object. So I'm going to zoom in over here on the front view. I'm going to go to the maximize view. Now, to set up your pivot point, you're going to want to go ahead and go to the hierarchy tab and choose affect pivot only. And I'm going to go ahead, and zoom in on my cherry, and you can see that I have my pivot point showing. So this is the location that the position of our object is based off of, and our rotational axis. In some cases, you might need to move your pivot point. This is maybe because you want to line everything up onto one edge or the top or the bottom side of your object versus the center of your object. Or maybe you've modeled your object and where you would like the rotation to happen is no longer in the right position. So if I were to zoom out here, I can go into my move tool. And again, I've got the effect pivot point only turned on, and I could potentially move this pivot point to wherever I want. Now I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Another option that I have is over in the hierarchy tool, I can change the pivot point to be the center of the object, aligned to the object, or aligned to the world. More often than not, you might want to use the center of object option. And as you can see, what that does is it moves the pivot point to the center of our cherry. Now, this isn't really ideal in our situation, but again, you might want to do this. I'm going to go ahead and undo. There we go. And the reason being is that when we created this model, the pivot point was the center of the sphere that we started with, and it just works perfectly for what we want here. So in this instance, we don't really need to do much with the pivot point as far as its position. However, there is one other thing that we will need to do. In 3ds Max, the Z value is always the up and down, and it's illustrated here in the pivot point by the blue arrow facing up. However, in Unity, the up and down is represented by the Y value. So to ensure that our model is imported into Unity in the correct orientation and rotation, we need to change the pivot point so that the Y value is facing up. To do this, with the effect pivot point only selected and our pivot point showing, we're going to right click on the rotation tool. This is going to give us the rotation transform option. And we're simply going to rotate along the X axis to flip the Y up. So in the X option here, I'm going to do 90. And immediately you can see that the green arrow is facing up. This is our Y. So Y is now our up and down. I'm going to close our rotation, go back to selection mode, and make sure that I turn off the effect pivot only option so that we are back to editing the model. I'm also going to go ahead and zoom back out of my view here. I'm going to do a zoom extends all to get everything back in the view. The last thing that we'll want to do is to move our objects to the 0, 0 point. When importing objects into our Unity scene, we have the option to place our object anywhere in the scene. However, it makes it a lot easier to find those objects if when you pull it into the hierarchy in Unity, it places it immediately at the 0, 0 point. So we can find the model really fast and position it after that. So to do this, we need to make sure that our model is at the 0, 0 point in max before we export. With the model selected, we need to right click on the move tool, and here you can see our absolute world position. So again, as we're modeling, it doesn't matter where in space we're modeling, but once we've gotten to this point, we need to move our model back to the 0, 0 point. So I'm simply going to select my X, set it to 0, set the Y to 0, and make sure that Z is 0. And I'm going to close this dialog. Our model has disappeared. It's simply moved off screen. So again, I'm going to go down to my zoom extends all and zoom in on my object. And if I zoom out here in the front view, you can see these dark black lines. That is the 0, 0 indication on the grid in max. So it is in fact at the right location. Now, all these changes that we made, the scale, the pivot change, the move, they need to happen in specific order. You'll want to do your reset XForm first, because if you make any of those other changes and you reset the XForm, they become the 0, 0. So everything that you did with your pivot sort of gets reset and nullified. So you want to do your reset XForm first. Then you'll probably want to move to your pivot point, because you want to position your model at the 0, 0 point based off wherever your pivot is. And if you need to make changes to those pivots, you need to do that first. So you'll do the reset XForm, then you'll affect the pivot, and then lastly, you'll move your object to the 0, 0 point. Now, before we export our projects, it's a good idea to go up to File and Save As, and save our project as an increment, so that if something goes wrong in our export, we have a copy that we can go back to. So I'm going to hit save. Now that I've got the project saved, we can go ahead and export our model. So I'm going to select the model here, and we're going to go to File and Export. And we have two export options. We can export the entire scene, or we can export the selected model in the scene. In my case, it doesn't matter. I have one object in the scene. But if you had a larger scene, you could choose which one you want to do. I'm going to just do export. In our export dialog, it's going to come up with our export folder, which was created when we created our project folder. And down here, it's going to tell us what the save type is. And we want to make sure that we are saving this out as a Autodesk FBX file format. This is the format that Unity uses for importing models. The last thing we want to do here is to set the name of our model. So I'm just going to name it Cherry and hit save. We now see the FBX exporter options dialog, and this dialog will allow us to pick and choose how and what we want exported. So in the include section here, if I hit geometry, this identifies the types of geometry that we're exporting with our model. And I'm going to leave this all set to default for our purposes. So that is all good. You can also set up how you want animations, cameras, lights, and audio exported. We don't have any of that in this particular scene, so we're not even going to mess with it. What we do want to check is the embedded media. If your model has any materials that you created in 3ds Max that you want to export with the model and bring into Unity, you need to make sure that embedded media is checked. This will embed the materials to the model and export them out along with the object. So make sure that embed media is turned on. The next thing that we want to check are the units. We want to make sure that our scale factor is indeed set to a scale factor of 1 and is doing automatic scaling. If we set up our units correctly at the beginning of the project, this scale factor of 1 will equate to 1 meter when we import this into Unity. The next thing we want to do is we want to set which direction is up. And this is which direction is up for 3ds Max. In our case, Max uses a Z up axis, and this should be the default setting. But we're going to set this up here. Remember, we rotated the pivot of our object, so even though it's saying Z is up here, when it loads into Unity, it'll come in the right orientation. And then all we have left to do is press OK. Back in our project folder, if we go to the export folder, we can see we now have a Cherry FBX, which we can import into Unity. I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and don't forget to check out our other tutorials on the channel. What are you waiting for? Get creative today!